My family disowned me, then needed my help. If someone had told me years ago that the same family who threw me out would one day come back begging for my help, I would have said they were crazy. Not because it could never happen, but because when my family turned on me, they did it without hesitation. No warning, no doubt, no mercy, and the worst part was, I had done nothing to deserve it. My name is Daniel, and for most of my life, I was the reliable son. I was the one who stayed out of trouble, the one who worked hard, the one who stepped in when things went wrong. When my father's business started failing, I helped cover bills. When my younger sister's school fees were overdue, I paid part of them. When my older brother disappeared, chasing one bad idea after another, I was the one everybody called. I thought being dependable made me valuable. What I did not understand back then was that in some families, the more dependable you are, the easier it is for people to use you. Everything changed the year my grandmother died. She was the only person in that house who saw me clearly. She never treated me like I had to earn basic kindness. She used to tell me, "One day, the people you carry will complain that you are not moving fast enough." At the time, I laughed. I did not realize she was warning me. After she passed, the family gathered to discuss her savings, her property, and a piece of land she owned in the village. My father acted like he was in charge of everything. My mother cried louder than anyone. My sister kept whispering to people in corners. And my brother, who was rarely useful, suddenly looked very interested in family matters. I sat there thinking we were going to honor my grandmother's wishes. Instead, they were preparing to destroy me. A week later, my father called a family meeting. The mood in the room felt wrong immediately. My mother would not look at me. My sister was gripping her phone tightly. My brother looked far too calm. Then my father looked straight at me and said, "Daniel, we know what you did." I remember staring at him, genuinely confused. I asked him what he was talking about. My mother spoke next. She said it was about my grandmother's money. For a second, I actually laughed, because the accusation was so ridiculous it sounded unreal. But nobody else was laughing. My brother leaned forward and said I had been the one closest to Grandma, the one who visited her most, the one who had access to her things. Then my sister showed me screenshots on her phone. Bank alerts. Transfers. Large amounts of money moved out of my grandmother's account shortly before she died. And according to those screenshots, the money had gone into an account under my name. I felt like all the heat had left my body. I told them it was fake. I told them I had never touched her money. I told them someone had to be setting me up. But the more I spoke, the more they looked at me like I was digging myself deeper. My mother said if I needed money, I should have asked. That hurt more than I can explain. I had been helping them financially for years. I paid bills in that house. I bought food. I handled emergencies. I was the person they leaned on whenever life got hard. And now they were looking at me like I was some thief who stole from an old woman before she died. My brother stood up and pointed at me. He said, "You always thought you were better than us. Now we see who you really are." That was the moment I understood this was about more than money. This was years of resentment looking for an excuse. My father said I had brought shame on the family. My mother said the neighbors must never hear about it. My sister said I should confess and return what was left. And my brother said that if I had any dignity, I would leave. Leave. The house where I had paid electricity bills. The house where I had fixed problems nobody else cared enough to fix. The house where I had helped keep everyone afloat. I looked at my father and asked if he was really throwing me out over screenshots on a phone. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Until you clear your name, you are not my son." That was the day my family disowned me. No real investigation. No serious questions. No one asking whether any of it made sense. Just judgment. I packed 2 bags that night. My mother stayed in her room. My father would not come outside. My sister watched from the hallway like I was a stranger. And my brother stood by the gate with his arms crossed, looking almost pleased. As I walked out, he said, "Maybe now you'll learn humility." That line stayed with me, not just because it was cruel, but because of the look on his face when he said it. He looked prepared, too prepared. The months that followed were some of the worst of my life. I lost my home, but that was only part of it. I lost my reputation too. In the kind of community I came from, bad news travels fast, especially when it sounds scandalous. Relatives stopped calling. Friends became distant. People who used to praise me suddenly looked at me with suspicion. Even at work, I could feel the difference. Nobody said much directly, but I could tell they had heard something. I rented a tiny room at the edge of town and tried to survive quietly. Some nights I lay awake replaying that family meeting in my head. The screenshots, the accusations, my brother's confidence. The more I thought about it, the less it felt random. So I started digging. At first, all I wanted was to prove I was innocent. I went to the bank and asked questions. What I found made my stomach turn. According to the records, the receiving account did carry my name. Same full name, same date of birth. But one digit on the identification record was different. Just one digit. That was all it took. Someone had opened a fake parallel account using my details with one tiny change. Close enough to fool my family. Close enough to point suspicion at me. But not close enough to survive a real investigation. When I asked how the account had been opened, the bank officer said it had been done through an agent using physical documents. Physical documents. That meant someone had used copies of my ID. And there was only one person in my family who had ever had easy access to those documents. My brother. That was the moment everything shifted for me. I stopped trying to make my family understand. And I started trying to uncover the truth. I requested transaction details. I checked dates. I followed whatever trail I could. Some records were blocked, but one bank employee quietly hinted that several withdrawals had been made from an area my brother visited often. Not my area. His. Then I remembered something my grandmother had said weeks before she died. She told me someone had been pressuring her to sort out the property quickly. At the time, she never mentioned a name. She only shook her head and said greed makes people ugly. Now I knew exactly who she had meant. But knowing was not enough. I needed proof. So I rebuilt my life while I kept digging. I worked longer hours. I changed jobs. I picked up new skills. I stopped wasting energy trying to convince people who had already chosen not to believe me. Slowly, my life began to change. I got a better role at a logistics company. Later, I moved into compliance and fraud review, which still feels ironic when I think about it. The man accused of stealing became the one trusted to investigate suspicious transactions. Life can be cruel like that, but it can also be strangely fair. Within a few years, I had a stable income, a decent apartment, and something I had not felt in a long time. Peace. Not perfect happiness, just peace. No shouting, no manipulation, no one treating me like my worth depended on how much I could give. Then one day my phone rang. It was my sister. I had not heard her voice in nearly 4 years. At first I almost ignored the call, but something in me told me to answer. She was crying. Not the kind of crying people do when they want sympathy. This sounded real. Shaky. Desperate. The first word out of her mouth was, "Please." I said nothing. Then she told me my father was in the hospital. His kidneys were failing. The treatment was expensive. The business had collapsed. My mother was unwell too. My brother had disappeared again. And the same relatives who had encouraged them to turn their backs on me were nowhere to be found. Then she finally said it. "We need your help. Not how are you. Not we're sorry. Not we were wrong. Just we need your help." I asked her one question. "Where is James?" "My brother." She went quiet for a moment and then admitted they did not know. That told me everything. The son they defended had vanished. And now they were calling the son they threw away. I wish I could say I felt compassion right away. I did not. I felt anger. Years of it. Anger at the humiliation. Anger at the silence. Anger at the fact that they only remembered I existed when they ran out of options. So I said no. And for the first time in years, I slept peacefully. But 2 days later, the hospital called me directly. My father had listed me long ago as an emergency contact, and apparently nobody had ever changed it. A nurse said they needed a family decision about part of his treatment. Family. That word nearly made me laugh. Still, I went. I told myself I was not going for him. When I walked into that hospital room, I barely recognized my father. He looked smaller than I remembered. Weaker. Like life had slowly worn him down. My mother was half asleep in a chair, and my sister looked exhausted. When she saw me, she stood up so quickly she almost lost her balance. Then my mother opened her eyes and saw me too. The look on her face was not relief. It was shame. The kind of shame that comes too late to undo anything. She started crying immediately and said my name. I stopped her before she could say more. I asked to speak to the doctor. We went through the treatment plan, the costs, and the urgent decisions that had to be made. I could afford to help, and they all knew it. But having the ability to help is not the same as having the desire. After the doctor left, the room fell silent. My father looked at me and said, very quietly, "You came." I told him the hospital called me. I did not come because he asked. He nodded like he knew he deserved that answer. Then my mother began repeating the same words over and over. We were wrong. I had imagined hearing those words for years. But when they finally came, they did not heal anything. Because an apology after damage is not the same thing as trust before it. So I asked the question that mattered. Did you ever find out who stole Grandma's money? Nobody answered. My sister looked down. My mother cried harder. My father shut his eyes. And in that silence, I realized something that hurt almost as much as the original accusation. At some point, they had started to suspect the truth. And they still never came for me. They let me stay erased. I told them they had chosen him over me even after they began doubting the lie. My father whispered that they were ashamed. I told him no. They were cowardly. No one argued. Then my sister said something that changed everything. She said James had confessed to her. The room went still. She was shaking as she spoke. She said he had shown up drunk one night, angry and desperate for money. And during an argument, he admitted he had used copies of my documents to open the fake account. He believed Grandma trusted me too much and might leave me more. So he moved the money first and made sure suspicion would fall on me. And once the family believed it, he decided there was no reason to fix anything. He got the money, and he got rid of me. Even though I had already suspected it, hearing it said out loud felt like being hit all over again. I looked at my sister and asked why she had kept that from me. She broke down and said she was scared. That word again. Everybody had been scared. And somehow I was the one forced to carry the consequences of everybody else's fear. I walked out of the room and sat alone in the corridor for a long time. I thought about my grandmother. I thought about the night I left home with 2 bags. I thought about every meal I skipped, every rumor I endured, every moment I questioned my own memory, because the people closest to me were so sure I was guilty. And eventually, I made a decision. I went back into that room and told them I would pay for the treatment. My mother looked shocked. My sister started crying again. My father stared at me like he could not understand what he was hearing. Then I made myself clear. I told them I was helping because of the kind of man I chose to be, not because they had earned it. And after the treatment, we were going to deal with the truth properly. Legally. Publicly. Completely. For the first time in years, I felt stronger than all of them. Not because they needed me, but because I no longer needed anything from them. Over the next few weeks, I paid for my father's urgent care and arranged for better treatment. But I also hired a lawyer. We reopened the financial trail. We gathered statements. We documented the false account. My sister gave a written statement. And eventually, with enough pressure, we found my brother. He was hiding in another city, broke and drowning in debt. At first, he denied everything. Then the documents came out. Then the signatures. Then the transaction records. Then the agent information. And just like that, the truth he had buried for years dragged itself into the light. Relatives started calling to apologize. It was too late. Some told me I should let it go because he was still my brother. Too late. Others said family should stay united. Funny how people only talk about unity when the victim finally has the power to answer back. In the end, my name was cleared. Officially. Publicly. The same people who once whispered about me now whispered about what had really happened. My brother faced the consequences. My father survived, but he was never the same. My mother tried more than once to repair the relationship. My sister still sends me messages on holidays. As for me, I learned something I will never forget. Blood does not guarantee loyalty. Shared history does not guarantee safety. And being needed is not the same thing as being loved. My family disowned me when it was convenient. Then they needed my help when the person they chose over me abandoned them. I helped them, yes. But I did it on my terms. Not as the broken son begging to be accepted again. As the man they should have believed from the beginning. And if there is one thing this taught me, it is this. Being rejected can break you for a while. But sometimes rejection is exactly what forces you to build a life that nobody can control. And when the people who tried to erase you finally come back empty-handed, ashamed, and desperate, you do not need revenge to win. Sometimes winning is simply surviving them.